how the 2015 Lions could have made the playoffs. This is something I've never really heard anyone talk about, and I thought it would be kind of interesting, perhaps maybe even change the trajectory of the Lions a bit and going into the mid and to late 2010s. So here we go. What if this happens? What if that happened? What if? An NFL theory. After spending the 2000s as being one of the worst teams in the league, the Lions began pretty much in the 2010s the same exact thing they were throughout their franchise history, being inconsistent and mediocre. After going 7-9 in 2013, when they had a couple game lead over everyone else in the NFC North and blew that division, they fired their head coach Jim Schwartz and brought in Ravens offensive coordinator and former Colts head coach Jim Caldwell, and the Lions immediately turned around in 2014, going 11-5 with one of the best defenses in the league, making the playoffs, almost winning the NFC North and getting first round bye or maybe even home field advantage, but ended up losing a close one to the Cowboys. So heading into 2015, the Lions had a lot of expectations, but after letting Nick Fairley and Ndamukong Suh go, the free agency, the defense lost a lot of its identity, and to make matters worse, the offense, after having a step back in 2014, fell off a cliff in 2015 as they start off 0-5 before halfway through the season being 1-7. Immediately after that 1-7 start, their owner, Martha Ford, made a whole bunch of fire-ins to the coaching staff, and it gave the Lions a hint that they needed to do an immediate change, and they did so. The team completely turned it around the final 8 games of the season, going 6-2 and looking really good to save their season at 7-9. For the Lions to make the playoffs in 2015, there's nothing really that much needs to be changed. In fact, all it needs is just 2 games to be changed, and all of them were very close and easily could have changed, but for different reasons. Now, what are those games? First, their Week 4 Monday night game at the Seahawks. The Seahawks won that game 13-10. However, there was a major controversy when near the end of the game, when the Lions were in position at the goal line to get the game-winning touchdown, Calvin Johnson caught the possible game winner. However, Cam Chancellor, as you see in this picture, knocked it out of his hand. It was a fumble, and Seahawks defender KJ Wright intentionally pushed the ball out of the end zone, which should have been called a penalty that would have given the Lions the ball at the 1-yard line, and they could have possibly won on that one. So that was an officiating error. And this time around, let's say either Calvin Johnson actually goes in, or the fumble still happens, but they call correctly and they get it on the 1-yard line. So the Lions win this one. They're 8-8, and the Seahawks fall to 9-7. And then their second game is the Miracle at Motown, which was their Week 13 Thursday night game hosting the Packers. And in that game, the Lions were destroying the Packers. They led the entire game until the final play, when they actually sacked Aaron Rodgers. However, it was a face mask penalty, so the Packers had one more shot, and Aaron Rodgers flew a beautiful pass that their tight end Richard Rodgers caught for the game winner, as you see right here in this picture, with no time remaining. This was completely the Lions' defense's fault. We'll go watch this play on YouTube. How the hell did they let him get wide open like that for the game winner instead of covering him double or triple coverage? But in the end, it somehow happens. And of course, the face mask penalty earlier didn't help much either. So for this scenario, either they don't get the face mask penalty, which would have ended the game right there, or they somehow cover Richard like they should have, double or triple coverage, and the Miracle of Motown never happened. And with that victory, both the Packers and the Lions are now 9-7. With all these changes, the Lions now have the tiebreaker over the Packers, as they swept the Packers in this scenario, and since they have the tiebreaker over the Seahawks as they beat them, the Lions not only make the playoffs, but they clinch the 5th seed, and then the Packers fall to the 6th seed as they have the tiebreaker against the Seahawks. So the Lions would get into the playoffs, move up to the 5th seed, the Packers would fall to the 6th seed, and the Seahawks would miss the playoffs completely. Since nothing changes on the AFC side, it'll still be the Broncos that make the Super Bowl. The NFC wildcard begins with the Packers visiting the Vikings in their rematch from just a week earlier when the Vikings won the NFC North. Now this one could possibly go back either way because the Packers were of course red hot in the playoffs that year, and they also destroyed the Vikings when they visited them earlier in the year. However, the Vikings did just go into Lambeau the week before and beat them pretty convincingly too, and the Vikings really were on a giant roll at that point. I think winning 3 games in a row going into the playoffs. So it could be close, but I think the Vikings would once again beat them in the second week in a row. And then it would be the Lions visiting the Redskins in one hell of an interesting matchup, as the Lions were of course red hot at this time, and the Redskins also got hot too when Kirk Cousins came into his own, so this game would be really interesting. However, I think the Lions were a little bit better at this point than the Redskins were, especially on defense. So I think the Lions actually could go into Landover and knock off the Redskins and get their first playoff win since 1991. Then it's the Vikings visiting the Cardinals in their rematch from a few weeks early in the year on Thursday night. The Vikings just barely lost that one. And of course, like I said, the Vikings were on the roll, and the Cardinals actually were struggling with injuries at that point, particularly Honey Badger. So I actually think in the rematch, the Vikings actually could go into Glendale and knock off the Cardinals, believe it or not. And that's what would happen in this scenario as they move on to the NFC Championship for the first time since 2009. The next day, the Lions visit the Panthers, where, unfortunately for the Lions, their playoff hopes end here as the Panthers dismantle them as badly as the Panthers did the Seahawks and the Cardinals. So now our NFC Championship is the Vikings visiting the Panthers. The Vikings, of course, could give the Panthers a lot of headaches, especially on defense, but we all saw what the Panthers did to the Seahawks and the Cardinals in the playoffs, and I think that would happen here as the Panthers would still beat the Vikings. So with that, the rest of the playoffs remains the same as the Broncos still beat the Panthers in the Super Bowl. But of course, the interesting thing is what happens to the Lions after the season. Since the Lions still make the playoffs in this scenario, and they make the playoffs the next year too, perhaps Jim Caldwell would keep his job after 2017 when they missed the playoffs. And perhaps possibly even bigger question is, perhaps maybe Calvin Johnson stays on the Lions since they were able to make it back to the playoffs. Perhaps Calvin Johnson would have the bad taste in his mouth of the Lions being inconsistent, and perhaps he would still be on the Lions, which of course would make that 2016 and 17 team much more scary, and probably much better in position to make playoff runs. But hey, that's just a theory, an NFL theory, and this was an interesting one too. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you think the Lions could have made an even bigger run, maybe make it all the way to the Super Bowl. Or maybe you think the Lions are just, as always, too mediocre to have anything going right for them. And with that, this is the final theory that's pretty short for a good while, as I got a bunch more complex theories coming into works very soon that are over a span a bunch of years. So see you soon for the next one, as, oh boy, it's a very good one that I don't think anyone's talked about yet.